Good morning, Metalheads here, and welcome to a new episode of the Metal Meltdown. And today we're looking at the latest album from Deathwhite, entitled Grave Image. Deathwhite is the sophomore album from Grave Image, a band that I don't really have a lot of information on, but that might be intentional, because based on the information I do have, they tend to keep things pretty close to the vest, pretty mysterious, pretty coy. Hell, as far as the lineup itself is concerned, it's a very similar scenario to that of Midnight or Panzerfaust, where we don't really have Brad on drums or Dave on guitar and Cindy on bass. We have these characters, they're all anonymous and whatnot. No one knows who they really are. That element of mystery helped to draw me into the world of Deathwhite and Grave Image, but what kept me there was this album's strong, cold, and melancholic brew of gothic metal, doom metal, post-metal, melodic death metal, and even a little bit of alternative metal that ranks every bit as heavy sonically as it does tonally. It has elegance, it has finesse, it has genuine heart and soul, but it's also not afraid to kick a little ass when it needs to. It's got some dirt under its nails, it's got some blood in its mouth. And while it does on surface level stick a little too close to some of the genre's tropes and cliches, digging a little deeper reveals a little bit more, and even if you don't dig a little deeper, it's still a thoroughly entertaining and confident record. To the point where I'd even say that it would only take a little bit of spitshine for Deathwhite on their next album to really shock the world of metal. Opening track Funeral Ground starts the album on some moody, strained guitars before introducing some heavier drums, some mournful vocals, some almost epic kind of soundscapes, like something I would hear in the background of some really dreary, miserable fantasy show. What really impresses me right off the bat is the vocals. They're able to cut through walls of fog and rain without being overtly extreme or forceful. It's actually quite delicate, and on this particular song, Funeral Ground, there's a really great contrast between these soft-spoken, mournful vocals and the almost epic, doom-centered guitar riffs. The general dynamic and execution reminds me a lot of another modern doom metal band, Chemist, but definitely a lot more depressing. Now, to some extent, this must be intentional because they do borrow even more heavily from Chemist on another track later on, Words of Dead Men, which also has some of the album's most thunderous hooks and guitar riffs. But I do think there's just enough of a gothic, doomy air floating through this to separate it from being a long-lost cut off of Desolation or something. Although, for the record, even if there wasn't, I wouldn't complain, because if you're gonna copy someone, it may as well be literally one of the best fucking bands of the last decade. Some of you by now might be thinking that you've got the general musical layout and landscape of this record pretty well figured out, and you're probably at least 50% correct, because a lot of the rest of the songs here do play out in some of the ways that I think you would expect them to. A lot of contrasting elements, definitely a lot of emphasis on some of the sounds that we've already talked about. For instance, In Eclipse borrows a lot heavily from the world of melodic death metal. There are elements here that remind me of Dark Tranquillity, particularly in the percussion and the way that it rises up underneath everything. Then you've got the title track, Grave Image, which kind of does dip its toes fully into the world of gothic metal, immediately hearkening to the likes of Catatonia and Paradise Lost. But even if you do have these sounds and ideas figured out, I think that Deathwhite does enough with them that it still feels pretty refreshing. It still feels very effective. The album is still thoroughly entertaining, and I think, as we've already made clear with the Chemist comparison, there's no shame in taking, blatantly even, from fantastic bands. And all the bands we've talked about are fantastic, at least I do. And again, this is assuming that you've got about 50% of the album figured out. This is assuming that you've got the surface level shit figured out. We haven't even gotten to the stuff underneath. We haven't even gotten to some of the weirder influences and ideas that Deathwhite do throw around quite subtly and effectively. So subtle, in fact, that even I didn't really notice them until they were pointed out to me by Angry Metal Guy in their review of this album. Take, for instance, the track Further From Salvation, which definitely still borrows heavily from the world of goth and doom. It's not a total left turn. My Dying Bride in particular comes to mind here. But pay close attention and you might even find just the tiniest dash of influence from the Alan Parsons Project. Angry Metal Guy even made a very odd argument that it borrows heavily from some late 90s Metallica, particularly The Memory Remains. And then you've got the wonderful closing track Plague of Virtue, which when you spend a little bit of time trying to figure out the ins and outs of it, does honestly remind you a little bit of Black from Pearl Jam. And don't worry, Eddie Vedder doesn't show up or nothing. We're not dealing with his Jarl goat vocal nonsense, but there is a certain essence that is very similar. And generally across the album, if you're paying attention, you can find bursts of influence from artists such as Scott Walker and Morrissey, particularly in the general aura of this thing. And I think that that's ultimately why I still find this album so refreshing, despite the fact that it does at times blatantly pull from a lot of the bands and genres that we've talked about. The way that everything has been arranged and mixed and brewed, it feels unique to Deathwhite, even if objectively it isn't. Now, do I wish that some of these ideas were a little bit better flavored and implemented into the core sound of this album? Sure, but I can't deny I'm impressed at how subtly woven into Grave Image all of these ideas are. And I do think that it is still a really enjoyable album, even when it does come across as perhaps, again, purely on surface level, as just being a hodgepodge of doom and goth metal stereotypes. For these reasons, I would give this a very enthusiastic 3.5 out of 5. I think there's a lot of really cool stuff going on here if you're a fan of all of the sounds that we've talked about. If you're worried based on some of the comparisons I've made that this is suddenly going to turn into like a fucking Pearl Jam record or an Alan Parsons record, don't. This is still doom and goth metal. And as I noted before, you probably wouldn't notice a lot of these very subtle elements unless I had pointed them out to you. They really are that subtle. But they do go a long way in making this album feel more unique. And I do think with that in mind, seasoned veterans of this genre will appreciate some of those ideas, some of those risks. And I would say to Deathwhite in the future, it might not be a bad idea to further explore the worlds of alternative and experimental music and explore these weirder territories and find new ways to implement them into your sound, because I think that with all that at your disposal, you've got the potential for your third album to be a real fucking banger. For now, Grave Image, 3.5 out of 5. I'm really impressed at the confidence that Deathwhite shows here. I'm really impressed by their musical palette. I'm really impressed by ultimately how enjoyable and entertaining this record is, and I'm really excited to see what these guys have in store next. And that is it for the Metal Meltdown. I'm not an expert, nor do I claim to be, so what do you think? Do you like this record? Do you not like this record? And what do you want to hear from me next? Thank you for watching. Make sure you press subscribe so you get updates on the Metal Meltdown fucking immediately, and you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.